U.S. Chapter 2, Section 3, Anti-Slavery Movement. What methods did Americans use to oppose slavery? So we'll look at the lives of enslaved people. We'll look at some of the leaders and the activities of the abolitionist movement. And we'll explain why many people opposed the abolition of slavery. And abolition means they wanted to get rid of. So anti-abolitionists wanted to keep slavery. So when you look at life under slavery, the big thing to kind of keep in mind is that this institution of slavery that gets formed isn't going to change overnight. So this is a photo from the 1950s, and we'll talk a little bit more about this. And lynchings, this use of terror to prevent African Americans from exercising their rights. There's this manner, and then there were legal manners. And when you really look at it, 1966, nearly 100 years after the end of the Civil War, African Americans are able to freely exercise the right to vote. So it's very difficult to overcome 365 years of history in basically a couple of generations. So when we look at the hardships of enslaved people, they worked from dawn to dusk. They were beaten and sold. Their families were divided. And one of the other elements is when you look at African Americans today, estimates kind of vary because you really don't know for sure, but somewhere between 24 and 30% of African Americans have European DNA in them, even if they have no known European ancestor. So that kind of tells you the system of slavery, which allowed white male slave owners to do whatever they wanted to whomever they wanted, whenever they wanted. When we look at some of the ways that they resist, some of these are pretty active. For example, breaking tools, intentionally slowing things down, leading slave revolts, sneaking away at night to visit your kids that were maybe living on neighboring plantations. And you also have the Underground Railroad, where people are actively helping slaves escape from the South to the North, and there's several different maps showing this. And Iowa had a pretty prominent role to play in the Underground Railroad. So below is a map that shows it. There were several different homes were active in the Decorah area. Some of the leaders, Garrison demands emancipation. He writes a paper called The Liberator, where he provides information about meetings and arguments against slavery. The call for emancipation is to free all slaves. The real big debate in the abolitionist movement is how quickly this should happen. So we're going to see that abolitionists, even though they share a common goal, they're not sure on the tactics and they're not sure on the timeline. And that limits their ability to really be as effective as they could have been. You know, had they put aside their slight differences on the timeline and focused more on their goal and working towards that goal, it probably would have been a more effective movement. Former slaves were probably by far the most effective speakers. For example, Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. The fact that they are able to speak from their own life experiences are the ones who are going to probably motivate and help others decide that this system needs to go. So these abolitionists are organizing all over the place. The Northeast, Midwest, the Iowa Public Radio, Television has put together a nice little series of podcasts talking about this. They would have lectures where they invite former slaves to speak and talk about what life was like. And one of the things is that this movement is really going to attract a number of women. This is going to be one of the first big causes, this and probably temperance, where women are going to play a very active role. And for women, they see the abolition of slavery, the ending of slavery, and slaves gaining rights as citizens as the next step for women to gain that same thing. So this gives them a way to get politically active and hopefully move the United States a little bit closer to allowing women to have rights. Henry David Thoreau is another leader in the abolitionist movement. He writes this essay on civil disobedience, the fact that it is a citizen's right and duty to refuse to obey unjust laws. That when the government is overstepping its bounds, that Americans need to step up and do what they need to do to call out this injustice to move things towards change. So what are the reasons for opposing abolition? For Southerners, they come up with a whole host of reasons as to why. Some of them are economic, that if the South doesn't have slavery, that they're not going to be able to compete with the rest of the world. Some of it is historical and biblical, saying that these things had always gone on throughout all of history, and so what was wrong with doing it now? The big difference is if you look at that historical biblical argument, the slavery in the United States, in the Americas, is different than any other time in history or any kind of biblical slavery. Legal, mostly pointing towards states' rights. Religious, that God made African Americans inferior, and so that was their station in life. The social good, humanitarianism, that really this is in the best interest of not just the American society, but for slaves as well, that they were far better off being slaves in the United States than being free in Africa. So those are some of the arguments that they use to defend it. It's also important to realize that Northerners are resisting abolition as well. Northern white workers fear the competition of free African workers coming into the factories. The other thing is they're benefiting from the supply of Southern cotton, and the whole of the United States benefited economically from the institution of slavery, that they made a tremendous amount of money on this slavery. Now, one of the things that's kind of coming back is some of these northern institutions, like, for example, Ivy League schools, they played a role in the buying and selling of humans, and they're kind of grappling with what do we do with that now? And that's one of the things that has been debated recently about how do we try and right a wrong where people are still suffering from that wrong. And there's no easy answer to that. What essentially is happening here is that this argument over abolition and slavery, the peculiar institution, Southerners didn't even use the term slavery because they found it too offensive. So they referred to it as the peculiar institution. In 1936, you see a group of Southern congressmen who introduced a gag rule where it is against the rules of Congress to bring up slavery and doing anything about slavery. And so it prevents any kind of discussion, any kind of debate. Already President John Quincy Adams worked for an amendment to abolish slavery. A lot of the founding fathers believed that slavery was going to go away because when they looked at cotton production in the 1790s, it looked like it was going to be a dying agricultural crop, that it was just going to disappear, and then slavery would kind of fade away because you really wouldn't need it anymore. The real important thing is regular everyday Americans are pretty split on the issue. They're not quite sure what to think about it, and what they're going to need is a series of events that are going to push them towards becoming more involved, more informed, and we're going to see that in the next chapter.